The crystalline spires of the Zarathi palace stretched toward twin suns, their surfaces catching light and fracturing it into rainbow cascades that painted the throne room in shifting colors. Ambassador David Kane adjusted his formal diplomatic collar and tried to project confidence he didn't entirely feel. 3 years of preparation had led to this moment, first contact negotiations with the most powerful alien civilization in known space. "Remember, Ambassador," whispered Secretary Mills beside him, "maintain eye contact during the greeting ritual, but don't speak until she addresses you directly. And whatever you do, don't flinch when she touches your face. It's considered deeply insulting." Kane nodded, his attention focused on the figure approaching down the crystal steps. Queen Valora of the Zarathi Empire moved with liquid grace, her tall, elegant form draped in robes that seemed to be cut from captured starlight. Her skin held a pale luminescence, and her violet eyes, the trademark of Zarathi nobility, regarded him with the cool assessment of someone accustomed to holding absolute power. "Your Majesty," Kane said, executing the bow he'd practiced countless times. "I am honored to represent humanity in these negotiations. Ambassador Kane." Her voice carried harmonic undertones that made human translation devices struggle to capture the full meaning. "We are curious about your species' proposal for peaceful coexistence." The formal words, the careful diplomatic phrasing, the measured distance, everything proceeded exactly as rehearsed. Kane straightened from his bow and prepared for the traditional Zarathi greeting, extending his hand palm up while Valora approached to complete the ceremonial first touch. Her fingers, cool and incredibly soft, brushed against his cheek in the ritual gesture. Kane felt the slight tingle that human xenobiologists had described, the bioelectric field that all Zarathi possessed. Standard procedure, formal contact, exactly as expected. Then Valora's eyes widened. Her hand, which should have withdrawn immediately after the ceremonial touch, remained against his cheek. Her violet eyes, so carefully controlled moments before, filled with something that looked like shock, recognition, and impossible hope. "No," she whispered, her voice losing all its formal tone. "It cannot be." Kane felt the change in the room's atmosphere. The assembled Zarathi nobles shifted restlessly, while the human diplomatic team exchanged worried glances. This wasn't part of the protocol. "Your Majesty." Kane kept his voice steady despite the confusion flooding through him. "Is something wrong?" Valora's fingers traced along his cheekbone with a gentleness that seemed completely at odds with her reputation as a ruthless political strategist. Her touch was searching, confirming something that logic insisted was impossible. "Your eyes," she said, barely audible. "Brown eyes with flecks of gold. And this scar." Her finger found a small mark near his temple, so faded he'd forgotten it existed. "From the tree branch when you were trying to reach the fruit for." She stopped abruptly, her hand jerking back as if burned. The regal mask slammed back into place, but Kane had seen something underneath it. Something personal and vulnerable and completely inappropriate for a formal diplomatic meeting. "Forgive me," she said, her voice returning to its ceremonial cadence. The bioelectric resonance was unexpected. "Perhaps we should postpone formal negotiations until tomorrow." "Your Majesty," Secretary Mills stepped forward, concern evident in his voice. "If there's a physiological incompatibility between our species." "There is no incompatibility." Valora's tone brooked no argument, but her eyes never left Kane's face. "Merely a need for private consultation with my advisors regarding certain aspects of the proposed treaty." Kane found himself nodding, though his mind was racing. The way she touched his face, the recognition in her eyes, the mention of a scar and brown eyes and fruit from a tree, it felt like fragments of a dream he couldn't quite remember. "Of course, Your Majesty. We understand the complexity of these negotiations. Ambassador Kane." She spoke his name as if testing it, as if comparing it to something else. "Would you be available for a private audience tomorrow morning? Before the formal sessions resume?" "Certainly, Your Majesty." She nodded once, a gesture that somehow managed to be both royal dismissal and personal promise. As she turned to leave, Cain could have sworn he heard her whisper something under her breath, a word that sounded like David, spoken with wonder and disbelief. Later, in the human delegation's quarters, Secretary Mills paced the length of the sitting room while Cain sat in confused silence. "I've never seen anything like that," Mills muttered. 20 years of diplomatic service, and I've never seen a first contact go sideways that fast. What do you think triggered it? Cain touched his cheek where Valora's fingers had lingered. The bioelectric tingle had faded, but the memory of her touch remained vivid, gentle, searching, familiar in a way that made no sense. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I don't think it was random." "You think she knows you? From where?" "This is humanity's first formal contact with the Zarathi Empire." Cain shook his head, staring out at the alien landscape beyond their windows. "I don't know. But when she touched me..." He paused, trying to capture the feeling. "It felt like coming home." Outside, the twin suns set behind crystal spires, painting the sky in shades of violet that reminded Cain of eyes he'd seen before, in dreams he couldn't quite remember. Tomorrow, he would have answers. Tonight, he had only questions and the lingering sensation of fingers that had touched his face as if they were greeting someone they'd thought lost forever. In her private chambers high above, Queen Valora stood at her own window, one hand pressed against the crystal as if reaching toward something impossibly distant. After 20 years of searching, after rising to power partly driven by the hope of this impossible reunion, she had found him. Her David. Her Star Watcher. The human boy who had saved her life and taught her to believe in kindness. The boy who had no memory of her at all. Cain arrived at the private audience chamber precisely on time, though he'd been awake most of the night trying to make sense of what had happened during the formal greeting. The room was smaller than the throne hall, with walls of translucent crystal that let in soft morning light from the twin suns. Queen Valora was already there, standing with her back to him, no longer wearing the elaborate royal robes. Instead, she wore something simpler, flowing fabric in deep blue that somehow made her seem more approachable, more real. "Your Majesty," Cain began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Please. In private, call me Valora." She turned, and Cain was struck again by those violet eyes, now filled with something that looked like nervous anticipation. "We need to discuss what happened yesterday. I was hoping you could explain it. My delegation is understandably concerned about the unusual nature of our first contact." Valora moved to a side table where an elegant crystal decanter held some kind of pale blue liquid. "Would you like some refreshment? It's a traditional Zarathi beverage, though I'm told humans find it somewhat sweet." "Thank you." Cain accepted the offered glass, noting how careful she was not to let their fingers touch during the exchange. "Valora, what happened yesterday? When you touched my face, you said something about brown eyes and a scar from a tree branch. How could you possibly know about that?" She was quiet for a long moment, sipping her drink while studying his face with an intensity that was both uncomfortable and oddly familiar. 20 years ago, she said finally, I was not a queen. I was barely more than a child myself, young, curious, eager to explore the galaxy beyond our home system. She moved to the crystal wall, gazing out at the palace gardens. I was part of a scientific expedition studying the Outer Rim territories when our ship malfunctioned and crashed on a primitive world. Cain felt something stir in the back of his mind, fragments of something that might have been memory or might have been dreams. The crash killed everyone except me, and I was badly injured. Stranded on an alien world with no way to contact my people, no knowledge of the local environment. Valora's voice grew soft with remembrance. I should have died there. But you didn't. No. Because a human boy found me. She turned back to face him, and Cain saw tears gathering in those violet eyes. A boy with brown eyes flecked with gold, who lived alone in a homestead at the edge of the wilderness. Who took one look at what he probably thought was some kind of strange animal and decided to help rather than run. Kane's glass slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering on the crystal floor. The sound seemed to come from very far away as memories crashed over him like a tide, fragmented images of finding something hurt and frightened in the woods behind his family's farm, carrying it home, nursing it back to health over long weeks of patient care. Star, he whispered, the pet name emerging from some buried part of his mind. I called you Star because of your eyes. Valora's composure finally cracked completely. She pressed her hands to her mouth, tears flowing freely now. You remember. Bits and pieces. I found you near the creek, didn't I? You were unconscious, bleeding from a head wound. Kane sank into the nearest chair as more memories surfaced. My parents were away on a trading expedition. I was alone at the homestead. For 3 months, Valora said, moving closer. 3 months you cared for me, shared your food with me, protected me from the predators that came near the house at night. You learned to speak basic. Faster than should have been possible. Kane looked up at her, seeing past the queenly bearing to something smaller, younger, more vulnerable. You used to sit by the fire in the evenings and ask me about the stars. And you would point them out, telling me the human names for the constellations. You said you wanted to visit them someday, to see what was out there. Valora knelt beside his chair, her voice thick with emotion. You called me Star, and I called you Star Watcher. The memories were flowing freely now, teaching her to fish in the creek, sharing simple meals, long conversations about everything and nothing. The way she'd laugh at his attempts to pronounce the few Zarathi words she taught him. How she'd curl up next to him during cold nights, trusting him completely. You were rescued, Kane said, the memory bittersweet. Ships came looking for you. My family's search fleet. When they found me, I was healthy, well cared for, and completely attached to the human boy who had saved my life. Valora's voice grew bitter. They were not pleased. What happened to me? After you left. Valora was quiet for a long moment, her expression pained. The ruling council deemed you a security risk. You had learned too much about Zarathi physiology, our language, our technology. They ordered your memories suppressed. Kane felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath him. Suppressed? A neural dampening field, applied during sleep. It was supposed to make those 3 months feel like a vague dream, nothing more. Valora reached out tentatively, her fingers hovering near his face. May I? He nodded, and she placed her palm against his cheek as she had the day before. This time, Kane felt something more than just the bioelectric tingle, warmth, connection, a sense of coming home that made perfect sense now. It didn't work completely, she whispered. I can sense the suppressed neural pathways. The memories are still there, just buried. Is that why you became queen? To find me? Partly. She smiled through her tears. Though I also discovered I had a talent for politics and a deep interest in interspecies cooperation. I wonder where that came from. Kane laughed, surprising himself. A boy who wanted to visit the stars and an alien girl who taught him that the universe was full of friends he hadn't met yet? Something like that. Valora's expression grew serious. David, may I call you David? There's something else you need to know. The memory suppression, your presence here as Earth's ambassador, the timing of these negotiations, none of it is coincidence. What do you mean? I've been preparing for this reunion for 20 years. Using my position to arrange circumstances that would bring you back to me safely. She stood, moving back toward the window. But there are others who remember what happened, who know about our connection. And not all of them are pleased that the human who once knew our secrets has returned. Kane felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Crystal Palace's cool air. Are we in danger? Possibly. There are factions within my court who see your presence as a threat, just as there are likely those in your government who would be alarmed to learn that Earth's chief negotiator has a personal history with the Zarathi royal family. So what do we do? Valora turned back to him, and for a moment, Kane saw not the powerful queen but the young explorer he'd once cared for. We do what we came here to do. We negotiate a peace that will benefit both our peoples. But we do it carefully, and we watch each other's backs. Kane stood, extending his hand toward her. Partners again? She took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. Always, Star Watcher. Always. Outside the crystal walls, the twin suns climbed higher into an alien sky, while inside, two friends began planning not just for peace between worlds, but for their own survival in a game where the stakes were measured in civilizations. Kane's dreams that night were vivid and strange, memories surfacing like bubbles from deep water, each one bringing back pieces of a childhood he'd thought lost to time. He woke to find himself speaking Zarathi words he didn't remember learning, his lips forming the complex harmonics as naturally as breathing. Velthara Neth Korim, he murmured, then sat up in shock as he realized what he'd said. Good morning, little star. The endearment he'd used for her during those long-ago mornings when she'd wake up curled against his side like an injured animal seeking warmth. The formal negotiations were scheduled to resume in 2 hours, but Kane found himself drawn to the palace gardens before dawn, following half-remembered paths through crystalline formations that caught and reflected the early light. His feet seemed to know the way without conscious direction. He found Velora sitting beside a fountain carved from what appeared to be a single massive diamond, her feet dangling in the luminescent water like a child despite her regal bearing. She looked up as he approached, and her smile was radiant. You're remembering more, she said, patting the crystal beside her in invitation. Too much. It's overwhelming. Kane sat down, noting absently that the crystal was warm to the touch despite the cool morning air. I keep expecting to wake up and find you curled up next to the fireplace, complaining about the cold. I wasn't complaining. I was expressing scientific curiosity about why human dwellings couldn't maintain optimal temperature regulation. Velora's tone was primly dignified, but her eyes sparkled with mischief. There's a difference. Right. Scientific curiosity. Is that what you called it when you refused to eat the fish unless I cooked them properly according to your very detailed specifications? That fish was nearly raw. I was trying to prevent food poisoning through proper culinary education. Kane burst into laughter, the sound echoing off the crystal formations around them. You were the most demanding patient I'd ever had. And I was 12 years old living alone on a frontier world, you were my only patient. I was appreciative of your care. I simply had standards. The banter felt natural, comfortable, as if the 20 years between their separation and reunion had compressed into nothing. But underneath the light-hearted conversation, Kane sensed something deeper, a careful probing, as if Velora was testing how much of their old dynamic had survived the memory suppression. What happened to your family? Kane asked. After they took you away. Velora's expression grew complicated. They were concerned about what I'd learned during my time with you. Not just your language or customs, but your way of thinking. You taught me concepts that didn't exist in Zarathi culture. Such as kindness without expectation of return. Protection offered to someone weaker without seeking to control them afterward. The idea that different didn't automatically mean dangerous. She traced patterns in the water with her fingertips. Very dangerous concepts for a young Zarathi noble to learn. Kane felt a chill. Dangerous how? Because they made me question everything about how our society functioned. The rigid hierarchies, the assumption that strength justified dominance, the isolation from other species based on supposed superiority. Velora looked at him directly. Do you know what the Zarathi Empire was like before I came to power? Expansionist. Aggressive. Your predecessors conquered 12 systems in 50 years. And do you know how many systems we've conquered in the 20 years since I became queen? Kane realized he didn't know, which was itself significant. None. None. Because a human boy once showed me that cooperation was more powerful than conquest, that understanding was more valuable than dominance. Her voice grew soft. You changed the trajectory of an entire civilization, David, and you never even knew it. Before Kane could respond, his neural implant chimed with an urgent message from Secretary Mills. The formal negotiations were beginning early. Apparently some kind of security concern had moved up the timeline. We should go, Kane said reluctantly. Yes, but first. Valora stood and moved closer to him, her expression serious. The memory suppression is breaking down faster than I expected. You might experience some disorientation as more memories surface. If that happens during the negotiations, I need you to trust me completely. What aren't you telling me? I'll explain everything tonight. But right now, we have a peace treaty to negotiate, and there are people watching us who would use our connection against both our species. She reached out and straightened his diplomatic collar with casual familiarity. Remember, in public, I'm Queen Valora and your Ambassador Kane. Can you do that? Kane nodded, though the simple touch of her fingers had triggered another cascade of memories. The way she used to fuss over his clothes when they prepared to check the trap lines, her concern for his welfare constant and touching. The formal negotiation chamber was filled with representatives from both species, the air thick with tension and carefully controlled expectations. Kane took his place at the human delegation table, while Valora assumed her position on the crystalline throne that dominated the far end of the room. For 3 hours, they maintained perfect diplomatic protocol. Kane presented humanity's proposals with professional competence, while Queen Valora responded with the calculated intelligence that had made her legendary among galactic leaders. To any observer, it was a textbook example of interspecies diplomacy. But underneath the formal language and careful posturing, Kane found himself conducting an entirely different conversation. A glance from Valora would trigger specific memories, fishing by the creek, sharing stories by the fire, the way she'd laughed when he tried to teach her human card games. Her subtle hand gestures weren't just royal emphasis, they were reminders of the private sign language they developed during those 3 months together. Trust me, her fingers spelled during a break in testimony. Danger close. Kane's training kicked in, his diplomatic composure never wavering even as his mind raced. Someone in this room posed a threat, but who? And why now? The answer came during the afternoon session, when Counselor Thane, one of Valora's senior advisors, stood to address the assembled delegates. Your Majesty, Thane said, his harmonic voice carrying undertones that Kane's newly awakened linguistic knowledge identified as contempt, perhaps we should discuss the unusual circumstances surrounding Ambassador Kane's selection for this mission. Kane felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees. Valora's expression didn't change, but her knuckles whitened as she gripped the arms of her throne. What circumstances would those be, Counselor? She asked with dangerous calm. The circumstances of his previous contact with our species. Contact that certain members of this court believe should have been, more thoroughly addressed 20 years ago. The human delegation erupted in confused murmurs, while the Zarathi nobles remained ominously silent. Kane realized with growing horror that he was about to become the focal point of an interspecies incident that could destroy any hope of peace. Counselor Thane, Valora said, rising from her throne with fluid grace, you seem to have information relevant to these proceedings. Perhaps you would care to share it with all present. Thane's smile was predatory. Gladly, Your Majesty. Though I suspect Ambassador Kane might prefer to tell the story himself. After all, he lived it. Kane met Valora's eyes across the chamber and saw 20 years of careful planning crumbling around them. Whatever game was being played here, the stakes had just increased dramatically. And somewhere in the back of his mind, another memory surfaced, Valora as a young alien girl, holding his hand during a thunderstorm and promising that whatever happened, they would face it together. The silence in the negotiation chamber stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Kane felt every eye in the room focused on him, waiting for his response to Counselor Thane's veiled accusation. His diplomatic training warred with newly awakened memories and the growing certainty that this moment would determine not just his own fate, but the future relationship between two civilizations. "Counselor Thane," Kane said, standing slowly, "I'm not sure what you're implying, but I'd be happy to clarify any concerns about my qualifications for this mission." "How refreshing. Honesty." Thane's tone carried the harmonics of satisfied anticipation. "Then perhaps you can explain to the assembled delegations how Earth's chief negotiator happens to be the same human who, 20 years ago, was deemed such a security risk that the Zarathi Council ordered his memory suppressed." The human delegation erupted in shocked exclamations, while Secretary Mills stared at Kane with undisguised horror. On the Zarathi side, several nobles nodded as if long-held suspicions had been confirmed. "That's quite an accusation," Kane said carefully, his mind racing through possible responses. "Do you have evidence to support such a claim?" "Indeed I do." Thane activated a holographic display that filled the center of the chamber. Recovered security footage from 20 years ago, showing a young human in the company of. "Enough." Velora's voice cut through the chamber like a blade, carrying harmonics that made every Zarathi in the room flinch. "Counselor Thane, you are out of order. Your Majesty, with respect, this information is vital to." "This information," Velora said, descending from her throne with predatory grace, "is being presented without context, without authorization, and in direct violation of sealed council proceedings." She moved to stand beside the holographic display, her presence somehow making the images seem less threatening. "If you wish to discuss historical events, Counselor, perhaps we should discuss all of them." Kane watched in fascination as Velora transformed before his eyes, not into someone different, but into someone more. The careful diplomatic mask fell away, revealing the brilliant political strategist who had risen to power through intelligence, determination, and an absolutely ruthless understanding of palace intrigue. "The human boy shown in these images," she continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the chamber, "was 12 years old when he found a crashed alien survivor. He could have reported the find to colonial authorities, could have turned the alien over for study and experimentation, could have sought reward or recognition." The hologram shifted, showing security footage Kane didn't remember being taken, himself at 12, carefully tending to an injured figure that was clearly alien in origin. "Instead," Velora said, "he chose to provide care, protection, and companionship to a being he knew nothing about except that it was hurt and alone. For 3 months, he shared his food, his shelter, and his friendship with someone whose species he had never encountered." Kane felt tears stinging his eyes as he watched his younger self, memories flooding back with perfect clarity now. The careful way he'd cleaned Velora's wounds, the patient hours spent teaching her human words, the protective fury he'd felt when predators threatened their makeshift family. When the rescue ships arrived, Velora continued, they found a healthy, well-educated alien child who spoke fluent Basic and had developed what could only be described as a profound appreciation for human virtues of kindness and cooperation. Counselor Thane's expression had shifted from triumph to growing unease. "Your Majesty, the security implications." The security implications were indeed significant, Velora agreed. "Which is why the Council made the decision to suppress the humans' memories and classify the entire incident. A decision I supported at the time, because I was young and afraid and more concerned with protecting my family's reputation than honoring the debt I owed." The chamber had fallen completely silent. Kane realized that Velora was revealing state secrets that could destabilize her entire government. "However," she said, her voice growing stronger, 20 years have passed. I am no longer a frightened child, and the human boy who saved my life has grown into a man whose credentials as a diplomat and xenobiologist are beyond question. His presence here is not a security risk, it is the foundation upon which lasting peace can be built." "You're admitting to a personal relationship with the human ambassador," Thane said, his tone sharp with accusation. "That invalidates these entire proceedings." "I'm admitting to a debt of honor that transcends political considerations," Velora replied. "And I'm also admitting to something else." She moved to stand directly in front of Kane, her violet eyes meeting his with perfect trust. I arranged for David Kane to be selected as Earth's chief negotiator. I spent 20 years maneuvering circumstances to bring him here safely, with the full knowledge and approval of the Inner Council. Kane felt the world shift around him. You, what? Did you really think your rapid advancement through the diplomatic corps was purely merit-based? Velora's smile was gentle but tinged with regret. Your linguistic abilities, your intuitive understanding of alien psychology, your innovative approaches to interspecies communication, they were remarkable because your suppressed memories were constantly influencing your choices. The holographic display shifted again, showing documents Kane recognized. His personnel files, his diplomatic assignments, his gradual rise through Earth's foreign service. I used my position to ensure you were given opportunities to develop your natural talents, Velora continued. I influenced trade negotiations to create openings for promising human diplomats. I suggested cultural exchange programs that would identify individuals with genuine empathy for alien perspectives. Secretary Mills found his voice. You're saying our entire diplomatic relationship with the Zarathi Empire has been manipulation? I'm saying it's been guidance, Velora corrected. Both our species have benefited from increased cooperation and trade. The manipulation was simply ensuring that when formal peace negotiations became necessary, Earth would send someone I could trust completely. Counselor Thane stepped forward, his expression triumphant again. Your Majesty has just admitted to 20 years of interference in human affairs. This is exactly the kind of overreach that... He never finished the sentence. The chamber doors burst open as security forces in unmarked armor flooded in, weapons raised. But they weren't targeting the human delegation, they were surrounding the Zarathi nobles. Counselor Thane, announced the leader of the security team, you are under arrest for conspiracy, treason, and unauthorized communication with hostile forces. Kane watched in amazement as Thane and 6 other Zarathi nobles were systematically detained. Velora, what's happening? Justice, she said grimly. Thane has been in communication with the Hegemony Remnant, sharing classified information about our defenses and political structure. His goal wasn't to expose our connection, David, it was to sabotage these negotiations entirely. Kane felt pieces falling into place. He wanted to prevent the peace treaty. More than that. He wanted to create an incident that would justify renewed hostilities between our species. Velora turned to address both delegations. The Hegemony Remnant has been funding extremist factions in both our governments, pushing us toward conflict so they can rebuild their power base in the chaos. Secretary Mills stepped forward, his face pale. Are you saying there are human 6 months later, Kane stood on the observation deck of the newly constructed joint embassy on Haven's Rest, watching the sunset paint the sky in familiar shades of gold and crimson. The planet where he'd spent his childhood had been transformed into the first official human Zarathi colony, its crystalline cities rising alongside traditional Earth-style settlements in a harmony that would have seemed impossible just a year ago. The integration reports are remarkable, Velora said, joining him at the railing. She'd traded her royal robes for practical work clothes, though she still moved with that unmistakable grace. Productivity in the joint research facilities is exceeding all projections. It helps when people actually want to work together instead of plotting each other's destruction, Kane replied, accepting the cup of coffee she offered. Though I still can't believe you've managed to make this stuff taste good. Zarathi biochemistry has its advantages. Though I admit, adding crystallized flavor compounds to a liquid base was counterintuitive at first. She settled beside him, her feet dangling over the edge of the deck like they had 20 years ago by the creek. Any word from Earth about the new exchange program? 300 applications for the first 50 positions. Apparently, working alongside beings with 15,000-year lifespans has a certain appeal for human researchers. Kane smiled. What about from the Zarathi side? Even better. The younger generation is fascinated by human innovation and adaptability. Professor Thalen submitted a proposal yesterday for a joint project studying accelerated creative development in short-lived species. Charming way to put it. You should see his research proposals about human music. He's convinced that your species' emotional instability is actually a sophisticated survival mechanism that enhances problem-solving capabilities. Kane laughed, marveling at how natural this had become, working alongside Valora to build something unprecedented in galactic history. The permanent cultural ambassador position had evolved into something far more comprehensive than either of them had originally envisioned. Speaking of problem-solving, he said, I got an interesting communication today. The Centauri Alliance wants to establish their own joint colony program, using our model as a template. That's wonderful news. Valora's expression grew thoughtful. Though I suspect they'll need guidance to avoid the pitfalls we encountered. The diplomatic corps is suggesting we serve as consultants. Apparently, our success here has made us the galaxy's experts on interspecies cooperation. Are you interested? Kane considered the question, looking out over the mixed architecture of the colony below. Human and Zarathi children played together in the streets, switching effortlessly between languages and cultural customs. In the distance, joint research teams worked on projects that combined human creativity with Zarathi precision, achieving innovations that neither species could have managed alone. I think our work here is just beginning, he said finally. But yes, I'm interested. As long as we're doing it together. Valora reached over and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his in the gesture that had become as natural as breathing. Always, Star Watcher. Though I should warn you, the Centauri have some very peculiar customs regarding diplomatic protocol. More peculiar than touching faces as a greeting. They communicate primarily through bioluminescent patterns. Very beautiful, but it makes formal negotiations look like a dance party. Kane grinned. After everything we've been through, I think we can handle some unusual lighting effects. Their conversation was interrupted by Kane's communicator chiming with an urgent message. The holographic display showed Admiral Hayes from Earth's diplomatic corps, her expression serious but not alarmed. Ambassador Kane, Your Majesty, she said, I have news that I thought you should hear directly. The Galactic Council has voted to establish a new framework for interspecies cooperation, based on the Haven's Rest model. They're calling it the Kane-Valora Accords. Kane felt his jaw drop. They're naming it after us. The proposal passed unanimously. Apparently, your success here has convinced even the most isolationist species that cooperation benefits everyone involved. Admiral Hayes smiled. Congratulations, Ambassador. You've essentially rewritten the book on galactic diplomacy. After the communication ended, Kane and Valora sat in comfortable silence, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. The same stars Kane had pointed out to her 20 years ago, when she was an injured alien child and he was a lonely human boy learning that the universe was full of friends he hadn't met yet. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't found each other again? Valora asked. Sometimes. But then I remember that you spent 20 years making sure we would. Kane squeezed her hand gently. Besides, I don't think the universe would have let us stay apart. Some connections are too strong to break, even with memory suppression and galactic politics. Very philosophical, Star Watcher. I learned from the best teacher. He stood, pulling her up with him. Come on, we have a colony to run and apparently some accords to sign. And coffee to improve, Valora added solemnly. The Centauri samples they sent were truly terrible. Of course they were. That's why they need our help. As they walked back toward the embassy, Kane caught sight of their reflection in the crystal windows, a human man and a Zarathi woman, hands linked, moving forward together into whatever challenges awaited them. Behind them, the lights of Haven's Rest sparkled like earthbound stars, while above them, the real stars shone down on a galaxy that was learning, one colony at a time, that differences were meant to be celebrated rather than feared. The boy who had wanted to visit the stars and the alien girl who had taught him to reach for them had found something better than adventure among the cosmos. They had found each other again, and in doing so, had shown two civilizations how to find peace. In the distance, a group of human and Zarathi children were playing a game that seemed to involve chasing bioluminescent patterns through the twilight, inventing new ways to have fun that neither species had imagined alone. Their laughter carried on the evening breeze, bright and joyful and full of promise for a future where such cooperation would be not just possible, but natural. Kane smiled, remembering a promise he'd made to a frightened alien child beside a creek 20 years ago, that no matter what happened, they would always have each other. Some promises, he reflected, were worth waiting a lifetime to keep.